Oh, I don't know. I mean, could have come off maybe a couple cemetery tombstones.
Imagine New York City in 1986 at the Bitter End nightclub in Greenwich Village. The air is thick with cigarette smoke, and the walls are steeped in decades of music history. It's the kind of venue where legends are born and old grudges find closure, at least, that's what people say. That night, Bob Dylan was scheduled to perform a surprise acoustic set, just a few songs. But right before he was set to go on, someone handed him a note, 3 words, just a name. Dylan read it, frowned, paused, and without saying a thing, turned around and walked out the back door into the cold Manhattan night, his guitar still slung over his shoulder. He never offered an explanation, not to the club, the media, or even the friend who invited him. But those close to him understood the weight that name carried and why it still lingered in his mind. Now, years later, and at the age of 83, Dylan is finally ready to speak. Known for avoiding interviews and sidestepping drama, he's beginning to open up, not out of bitterness or to seek applause, but in pursuit of the truth. And the list he's revealing isn't filled with enemies. These are names of former collaborators, icons, even friends. The first, a guitarist whose praise eventually turned into betrayal, Eric Clapton. On the surface, Dylan and Clapton appeared to be kindred spirits, 2 giants of guitar-led musical revolutions from different worlds who shared mutual respect. They played together at festivals, jammed in spontaneous live sets that fans still talk about, and exchanged admiration. Clapton once hailed Dylan as the greatest poet in music, and Dylan respected Clapton's deep connection to the blues. But tension simmered behind closed doors. In the late 70s, while Dylan explored gospel and spiritual sounds, Clapton reportedly made a comment that hit hard. According to a mutual producer, perhaps after a few drinks, Clapton suggested Dylan had lost his edge, and hinted that a new poetic voice was needed. Riding high on his solo success, he subtly implied he might be the one to fill that role. The words weren't overtly arrogant, but they lacked humility. When Dylan heard about it, he didn't react publicly, but insiders say the fallout was immediate. A planned recording session was abruptly cancelled, no reason given. Dylan came to view Clapton's polished charm as a facade, gracious on the surface, calculating underneath. And to Dylan, a songwriter's betrayal cut far deeper than any critic's review. Another name on the list is Joan Baez, a 1960s folk icon whose political ballads clashed with Dylan's turn toward introspection. She wasn't just a musical partner, she was a symbol of shared ideals. Together, Dylan and Baez were the folk scene's power couple, singing side by side, attending civil rights marches, and giving voice to a generation hungry for change. Their harmonies were statements, their presence at protests unforgettable. They brought urgency and humanity to folk music. But then Dylan changed. In 1965, he plugged in his guitar at Newport and traded activism for enigmatic, personal lyrics. The transformation wasn't just musical, it was ideological. Baez didn't just disagree with the shift, she felt deserted. While her music stayed rooted in activism, Dylan's move felt like a departure from everything they'd built together. She tried to bring him back, urging him to reconnect with his political past, and even criticized him publicly. He even told interviewers that he had lost his sense of purpose, describing his artistic transformation as a kind of selfishness. For Dylan, this wasn't just a disagreement about music, it felt like a betrayal by someone who had once understood his insecurities, his fears, and his drive, only to later use those things against him. It left a lasting wound. He never criticized her publicly, never responded through his music, but he made his stance clear. For more than 40 years, he refused to work with her again. When asked about the fallout in private, he quietly muttered, "She sang for the people, I was singing for myself." Then came perhaps the most surprising conflict, with a frontman Dylan had once helped bring into the spotlight, Lou Reed, the punk poet who publicly mocked him. Dylan had a deep appreciation for innovators, those who took risks, broke conventions, and reshaped music. He wasn't threatened by creativity, he was inspired by it. But what he couldn't tolerate was mockery, especially from artists he believed owed part of their careers to paths he had forged. Lou Reed, leader of the Velvet Underground, was one such figure. In a 1974 interview, Reed openly criticized Dylan, saying he had never meant much to him, dismissing his lyrics as meaningless and pretentious, and painting him as someone more concerned with self-importance than substance. The comments struck a nerve. Dylan didn't retaliate, there were no scathing lyrics or public statements. Instead, he responded with silence, the kind that speaks volumes. Lou Reed's name disappeared from Dylan's world. He was left out of liner notes, interviews, and tributes, completely erased from the narrative. The silence continued for years. Then, in the early 1990s, during an interview with Rolling Stone, a journalist casually mentioned Lou Reed. Dylan looked up from his cigarette, raised an eyebrow, and asked, "Who?" before smiling. It wasn't a joke, it was a rejection so absolute that it made a stronger statement than any direct insult. The next feud was far more dramatic, involving the outspoken iconoclast Frank Zappa, who openly ridiculed Dylan. Zappa never held back. He thrived on provocation, defied norms, and used sarcasm as a weapon. When he spoke of Dylan in interviews throughout the 1970s and 80s, he mocked Dylan's voice as a disaster, dismissed his lyrics as empty pseudo-intellectualism, and labeled his fans as misguided followers who believed they were enlightened. Many saw Zappa as a brilliant but incendiary figure and chose not to engage. But Dylan wasn't like most. Years later, at a low-key party in Laurel Canyon filled with musicians, writers, and producers, both Dylan and Zappa were present. A mutual acquaintance attempted to ease the tension by arranging a handshake. Dylan didn't move. He stood still, unwilling to reach out. The atmosphere tensed. Zappa, never one to shy away from discomfort, lifted his drink and quipped, "I hear silence is your best verse." Dylan didn't respond. He turned and left the party 10 minutes later. To an outsider, it might have seemed like an overreaction. But for Dylan, it was never just about artistic critique, he could accept that. What he couldn't accept was cruelty disguised as cleverness. To him, Zappa's barbs weren't insightful, they were mean-spirited and demeaning. And then came another name, once a friend, now an adversary, who pushed too far and left Dylan to face the fire alone. The poet who stole his darkness, Leonard Cohen. This story is different. Dylan held a deep, public, and profound admiration for Leonard Cohen. He once described him as representing the highest level of songwriting, an extraordinary compliment from someone known for being stingy with praise. The respect was genuine, yet beneath it simmered a more complicated emotion, a quiet rivalry and lingering resentment. Cohen's emergence in the late 1960s came just as Dylan was retreating from public life following his motorcycle accident. As Cohen's poetic, ascetic presence captured global attention, Dylan's absence became even more noticeable. Some insiders believed Dylan felt overshadowed, perhaps even replaced. Others whispered that Cohen's elegant, brooding aura made Dylan's untamed energy appear chaotic, outdated, even immature by comparison. The deeper wound, however, came from an interview in the early 1970s. Cohen reportedly said that Dylan's earlier work was juvenile when set beside the poetry of more mature writers. He hadn't meant it as an insult, he was reflecting on artistic growth, on change, on evolution. But Dylan took it as a personal slight, cloaked in intellectual language. He never responded in song or in public, but he didn't forget. Years later, when Cohen died, fans anticipated a moving tribute from Dylan, something befitting their shared legacies. Instead, they received 3 brief lines. No sentiment, no reflection, just a stark acknowledgement. And for Dylan, that said everything. Yet even that didn't cut as deep as what followed. The legend who let him down, Michael Bloomfield. Bloomfield had been Dylan's secret weapon on Highway 61 Revisited. His electrifying guitar, raw, sharp, and wildly spontaneous, was crucial in helping Dylan not just change his sound, but usher in an entirely new musical era. That album was a landmark, and Bloomfield stood at its heart. For Dylan, their collaboration was more than a success, it felt sacred. But after that groundbreaking moment, Bloomfield disappeared. He declined tour invitations, withdrew from sessions. Some blamed drugs, others said he couldn't handle the pressure. But Dylan took it personally. He had trusted Bloomfield during a pivotal moment, counted on him, and then watched him disappear without explanation. The real rupture, though, came not from silence but from what Bloomfield eventually said. In later interviews, he minimized Dylan's role, suggesting that it was he who saved Dylan's career by pushing him into rock. He implied he was the true inventor of folk rock, the one who gave Dylan the grit he lacked. Dylan was furious, not just hurt, but betrayed. To him, their work had been a creative exchange, a shared ignition. But Bloomfield had rewritten the story, casting himself as the lone spark. After that, Dylan's view of him changed forever. He never offered praise again. He never called him back. Finally, there's the feud that went beyond music, stretching back to the Beatles. The Beatle who dismissed his brilliance, Paul McCartney. The two had been friendly, shared joints, offered admiration, even appeared on stage together once or twice. But they were never truly close. There was mutual respect, but no deep connection. Dylan admired John Lennon's acerbic wit, his edge, his shadows. He saw in Lennon a rebellious spirit like his own. Paul, though, was different in Dylan's eyes, too polished, too mainstream, too eager to please. Dylan respected McCartney's undeniable talent, of course, but sensed he played it safe, writing catchy tunes while Dylan pursued deeper meaning. The breaking point came in 1987, when McCartney made an offhand remark in a magazine interview. He said Dylan's newer songs weren't memorable anymore. It seemed like a casual critique, but to Dylan, it felt like a slap, a dismissal of the complex, introspective direction his music had taken. These were songs full of nuance and shadows, not simple sing-alongs. And to Dylan, that comment revealed more than McCartney may have intended. Dylan chose not to respond publicly. He didn't release a diss track or vent in interviews. Instead, his actions spoke for him. He suddenly withdrew from a planned joint tour, offering only vague reasons, saying it just wasn't the right time. But those close to the situation knew the real story. In private, Dylan was more blunt. "Paul writes love letters," he reportedly said. "I write scars." The rift never fully closed. Though they maintained a civil front, a quiet distance remained. One thing has always been clear: Dylan admired McCartney's fame, but not his fire. The names on this list weren't random rivals drawn from nowhere. They were once collaborators in music, kindred spirits in lyrics, fellow rebels, and, at times, mirror images of Dylan himself. That may be why the splits cut so deep. Every person he distanced himself from seemed to echo a version of his own past, the young dreamer, the bruised poet, the passionate seeker. These weren't just falling outs, they were breaks in identity, reminders of who he had been, who he was afraid of becoming, and who he could no longer be. Now, at 83, Dylan isn't chasing vengeance. He's not reshaping the past to win old battles. He's simply revealing the truth, calmly, quietly, and with the same stark clarity he's always possessed. So, who surprised you most on this list? Which of these fractured relationships do you think still lingers in Dylan's heart, never spoken of, yet never fully healed? Share your thoughts in the comments, and don't forget to subscribe for more untold stories.